Détente. Détente is a French term meaning relaxation. It is used to describe periods of a thaw in Cold War when tensions between the superpowers lessened and relations improved. It is particularly applied to the years between 1971, when the first Nixon-Brezhnev summit conference was planned, and 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, causing a second Cold War. Détente was restored after Gorbachev became Soviet leader in 1985. The superpowers wanted détente for several reasons. Nuclear weapons were so powerful that war would mean mutually assured destruction. The arms race was costing both sides a fortune. And particular reasons that the Soviet wanted was that a breakdown of relations with China meant that it was important to reduce tension with the Soviet Union's other potential enemy, the USA. Now that the Soviet Union had caught up in terms of the arms race, it felt more confidence. In 1969, West Germany had agreed with East Germany not to acquire nuclear weapons, and this removed a potential threat. The need to increase trade with the West meant that the Soviet Union wanted détente. The Americans, however, saw failure in Vietnam as one particular reason. Nixon changed the direction of American foreign policy and set out to improve US relations with both China and the Soviet Union. Public pressure to reduce the risk of war and the USSR catching up with the arms race also meant the American feared that the Soviet Union was now becoming stronger than her. Attitudes to détente, however, were not always positive. Brezhnev made it clear that détente did not mean an end to the struggle between communism and capitalism. Western critics of détente said that the Soviet Union was interested only in the benefits of détente in itself, such as trade links and reduced arms expenditure. It was not interested in the improvements of human rights. The West had therefore made a mistake at Helsinki in accepting Soviet control of Eastern Europe. Western supporters hoped that increased contact with the West would change attitudes in the East. Despite détente, superpower rivalry continued, especially in the Arab-Israeli War of 1973 and in Angola between 1974 and 1975. Contact during détente. There were many summit conferences held. 5 were held between 1972 and 1979, the first 3 being between Nixon and Brezhnev. This led to agreements about procedures to reduce the risk of confrontation and nuclear war, a joint space mission in 1975, increased trade links and cultural exchanges. The European Security Conference in 1973 to 1975, where delegates from Canada, the Soviet Union, the USA and 33 European countries met in Helsinki. In 1975 they signed the Helsinki Accords, which recognized the frontiers of Eastern Europe, the Soviet control over the region, and West Germany recognized East Germany for the first time. There was increased cooperation when they agreed to cooperate through trade links, cultural exchanges, and exchanges of technological information. As far as human rights were concerned, they agreed to respect human rights and to allow people to travel freely across Europe. Many of the West believed that the Helsinki Agreement marked a breakthrough in persuading the Soviet Union to allow human rights, such as the freedoms of belief and expression, both at home and in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union made little effort to improve human rights, however. It continued to suppress critics such as Andrei Saratov. In Czechoslovakia, members of the Charter 77 group were suppressed. When the West criticized the Soviet Union's human rights record, Brezhnev said it was interfering in its internal affairs. When a US congressman tried to have a trade agreement linked to the improved treatment of Soviet laws, Brezhnev cancelled this deal. As far as arms controls were concerned, nuclear weapons in 1969, talks began about a Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT. The superpowers signed 2 treaties. In SALT I in 1972, they agreed to reduce the anti-ballistic missile systems, limits on the number of their offensive missiles and bombers. In SALT II in 1979, they agreed further limits on missiles, but the talks were less successful than hoped as a result of the Afghanistan war. In 1980, US President Carter refused to ratify the treaty because of the Soviet Union aggression in Afghanistan. As far as conventional forces were concerned, talks to reduce these made very little progress. The Soviet Union refused to reveal the size of the Warsaw Pact forces, and it made it clear it intended to maintain its superiority over NATO in this area. President Nixon and his attitudes to China. This was called ping-pong diplomacy. The USA tried to improve relations with China by allowing China to join the United Nations. The US table tennis team played matches in Peking alongside diplomatic visitors, giving rise to the term ping-pong diplomacy. Continuing animosity, suspicion, and border conflicts divided the Soviet Union and China, making the USA's initiatives easier to carry out with reference to China and to the Soviet Union. In 1971, America agreed to let Communist China into the United Nations, and in 1972 Nixon visited China and Moscow for talks. This led to further talks being able to be made throughout this period of détente, including SALT I, SALT II, and the Helsinki Accords. Why was the Cold War renewed under Brezhnev and Reagan? The Brezhnev Doctrine stated simply that once a country went communist, it would stay communist. In other words, the Soviet Empire would continue to advance and gain territory, but it would never lose any to the capitalist West. In Reagan's view, Ronald Reagan ordered American troops to invade Grenada and liberate the island from its ruling Marxist dictator. This was an example of how anti-communist Reagan was. He wanted to prevent the spread of communism at all costs. This caused great tension. Brezhnev's view was building up of the Soviet Union's forces and their military capability. He blamed the United States for perpetuating the Cold War, and this caused great tension. Reagan continued with his Star Wars program, his anti-ballistic missile program in space, and as a result, throughout the 1980s, there was renewed hostility between the Soviet Union and the USA. Events leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The end of the Soviet control in Eastern Europe began in March 1989. Gorbachev announced to the communist leaders that the Red Army would no longer be used in their defense. This meant that many protests in these countries would not be quashed by the Soviet armed forces. During the 1980s, satellite states of Eastern Europe had become increasingly unhappy with control from Moscow. This led to the establishment of Solidarity in Poland and widespread demonstrations in Hungary, where the banned national flag was used. They also began a loss of states. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and many other Baltic states, including Latvia and Lithuania, began to hold independent free elections and break away from what the Soviet Union was doing. The problem was that to those in the Soviet Union it seemed that Gorbachev was doing very little to prevent the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. People were also worried that economic reforms in the Soviet Union weren't effective, and they still suffer from rising food prices and shortages. This led to many wanting to see the end of communism, not just reforms, and in February of 1990, 250,000 people demonstrated in Moscow against communism. Gorbachev was booed at the annual May Day parade, both by those who felt he was weak and by those who wanted more reforms in the Soviet Union. It was the new president of Russian Republic, Boris Yeltsin, who encouraged the breakup of the Soviet Union. In August 1991, hardline communists led a coup against Gorbachev, who was made prisoner in his country home. Yeltsin led a protest against the coup and insisted the reforms continued. The communist flag was lowered for the first time over the Kremlin. Gorbachev resigned as president due to a lack of Soviet state for him to rule. When the Soviet Union collapsed, so did the Cold War. After the breaking down of the Berlin Wall in 1989, there seemed to be an increase in cooperation between East and West, and as a result the Cold War was over. It was believed that the Americans actually managed to defeat the Soviet Union and hence win the Cold War. However, many people believe that the Soviet Union managed to collapse itself from within, and the Americans simply were there to pick up the pieces and remain as the only superpower in the 1990s. Between 1929 and 1990, the involvement of America in world affairs has increased. America during the 1920s and 30s was increasingly following a policy of isolationism, where it refused to get involved in world affairs where it saw unnecessary involvements in European affairs around the world. However, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, America became involved in the Second World War, and after this it saw its fight against the spread of communism as being paramount to world safety. It led to involvements in Berlin, Korea, and Vietnam. However, after the Vietnam War and tensions increased significantly throughout the Cold War, a period of détente was seen throughout the 1970s and 1980s. America tried its best to try and negotiate with the Communist Soviet Union and Communist China in order to improve relations. After the Vietnam War, it was believed that the Cold War had gone far enough. The 13 days of tension throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated just how close the world had come to nuclear, mass assured destruction, mutually of each other. By the end of the 1990s, the Americans has absolutely involved itself in most world affairs, and it continues to do so. However, it must be realized that America believed this to be not a case of world domination, but a case in order to save the world from itself.